continuing in Acts 23 today. Apostle Paul, he's been arrested. He's been brought before the council in Jerusalem, and that turned into a free-for-all to where his safety became a concern. And then after that took place, his nephew overheard conversation about a plot to kill him and took that to the Roman commander. And the commander has made arrangements to be moving Paul to Caesarea for his protection, and is going to demand that if there's going to be anything brought against Paul, that they go to Caesarea before the governor there named Felix to present their case. And of course, we come down to the point where he needs to send a letter along, kind of indicating why Paul is being sent to him. And so we pick up in Acts 23, verse 25 today. He wrote a letter in the following manner: Claudius Lysias, to the most excellent governor Felix, greetings. This man was seized by the Jews and was about to be killed by them. Coming with the troops, I rescued him, having learned that he was a Roman. And when I wanted to know the reason they accused him, I brought him before their council. I found out that he was accused concerning questions of their law, but had nothing charged against him deserving of death or chains. And when it was told me that the Jews lay in wait for the man, I sent him immediately to you, and also commanded his accusers to state before you the charges against him. Farewell. Then the soldiers, as they were commanded, took Paul and brought him by night to Antipatris. The next day they left the horsemen to go on with them and returned to the barracks. When they came to Caesarea and had delivered the letter to the governor, they also presented Paul to him. And when the governor had read it, he asked what province he was from. And when he understood that he was from Cilicia, he said, I will hear you when your accusers also have come. And he commanded him to be kept in Herod's praetorium. And we'll stop there for now. All right. So as we initially are looking down through this letter, do you notice some things that are kind of interesting? All right. Let's take kind of a little bit of a look here. He says, this man was seized by the Jews. Well, that's true. He was seized by the Jews. They were trying to kill him and everything. And coming with the troops, I rescued him, having learned that he was a Roman. Notice, Lysias leaves out the part where he was about to scourge him, because he did not know he was a Roman. That he actually was taking him into custody and was going to question him as if he was a non-citizen. Conveniently leaves that part out. Okay? But remember, one of the things we noted about the Apostle Paul, while he does use the law to his advantage, he's not vindictive. He could have turned the tables on Lysias and had him prosecuted for the way he was being treated, and the fact that he had put him in chains and was preparing to scourge him. But he didn't. The only thing the Apostle Paul used the law for was to his advantage from the standpoint of seeing that he was not scourged and that he was treated as a Roman citizen. And then we also remember that when he was brought before the council, which Lysias conveniently leaves out, that turned into a free-for-all. When the Apostle Paul cried out, because of the resurrection, I'm on trial. So Lysias kind of leaves that out. Why? Well, because that would kind of give an indication that Lysias wasn't really in control of things there in Jerusalem like he should have been. And so he conveniently leaves that out as well as we're looking down through this letter. But then he does home in on the fact that he found out that, as he says, that he was accused concerning questions of their law there in verse 29, but had nothing charged against him deserving death or chains. In other words, Lysias is in many ways sending a defense for Paul in this letter. It's not really his intent, but that's what's actually here. That he's finding that there's really not any reason for him to even be on trial. That they're just upset with him about issues over the Jewish law, and as the Apostle Paul put it, because he believed in the resurrection and the Sadducees didn't. which resulted in the free-for-all and the dissension and everything. And then Lysias also brings up the fact of that he was told that the Jews were laying in wait. In other words, he's saying to Felix, I'm moving him to there to prevent an out-and-out riot. So this letter to Felix isn't just to give him information on what brought about Paul being arrested. It also is to bear out in Lysias' defense that he was taking measures to prevent a rebellion from taking place in Jerusalem. One of the things to note, if you go outside of Scripture, okay, if you were to go outside of Scripture and you look at most of the writings concerning things going on, all of the writers have a tendency to put themselves and the public officials in a good light. You did not write negative things about them. All right. Why? Well, that could get you in trouble with the powers that be. But one of the interesting things is about the Scriptures, which helps us to understand how reliable they are, is the Scriptures show us people how they really are. It doesn't if you got a bad character in there, it doesn't come along and sweep it under the carpet, so to speak, and try to make him look good. It presents him exactly as he is. And so if we were to have just the letter instead of the recording of the actual events, it would make everything look a whole lot less as intense than it actually was. But what we're seeing is how the events were actually very serious. I mean, it was very close to being looked at as a riot or even an out-and-out rebellion, and how Lysias, in his letter, which would have been public record everywhere else, kind of plays it down to make it look like it wasn't quite so bad. But he's got everything under control. When the reality is, when you know what the events were, you understand that Lysias is sending Paul to Caesarea because Lysias realizes he's about to lose control. And so what we end up seeing, we see the real story as opposed to the story that Lysias wants Felix to understand. And so that's one of the wonderful things about the Scriptures is we see people in the Scriptures for who they really are, not as someone who has had writings about them embellished for the good. I mean, if you even go farther back into more ancient times, back into most of the Old Testament period, what would typically happen when a new ruler came into power? Well, several things. He would try to wipe out any reference to his predecessor, and he would have the scribes write down and document how great he was and how wonderful he was when he came in and conquered everything. And that was true of the Egyptians, that was true of the Babylonians, that was true of the Medo-Persians, that was even true of the Romans for the most part. In many ways, they sometimes tried to remove things prior to them. And so the Scriptures are showing us the true events, and then how this letter has a tendency to play them down a little bit. But we see that the two main reasons that the Apostle Paul is being sent to Caesarea is for Paul's protection and in order to prevent a rebellion from occurring. And so, at night, they shuttle him out. And remember, one of the things we looked at last week, they helped us understand that a rebellion was close to what this was about to be, was the fact that they had so many soldiers that went with them. I mean, think about it. If Lysias wasn't thinking this was about to be a major, how shall I say it? Well, major rebellion, they wouldn't have needed hundreds of soldiers on horseback and on foot. It would have just been a general escort. But this is a very serious situation where things, just because the Apostle Paul have become so volatile in Jerusalem, that Lysias realizes, I got to get this guy out of here or I'm going to have a mess on my hands. And so he gets the soldiers together. And remember, he didn't tell them exactly what was going on. All he told them was, you're to take Paul from here to Caesarea. Back to that idea. Information on an as-need basis. All you need to know is you need to get him from here to there. That's it. The watered-down details are in the letter to Felix. And so they take Paul by night. And the first place they come to is Antipatris, which is probably 4 or 5 hours away, if that. It's not a major distance, but if you're driving, it would have probably been 10 or 15 minutes. Okay, but when you've got an entourage of soldiers who are not just on horseback, but they're also marching soldiers as well, things move along a little bit slower than hopping into our cars today and just driving a short distance. And so it's at that point that they no longer see the need for the horsemen to continue, but all the soldiers on foot still remain. And the other soldiers return back to Jerusalem. And then it says, in verse 33, when they came to Caesarea and had delivered the letter to the governor, they also presented Paul to him. In other words, here's the letter, and here's the man. He reads the letter, and notice where it says he has Paul put. Herod's Praetorium. Interesting. A praetorium is typically where the soldiers stay. It's not a prison. It's a form of barracks. And so we see God's hand at work even now, before the trial has even taken place here in Caesarea, that the Apostle Paul is getting much better treatment than the average person who's under supposed arrest. Any thoughts, comments? Okay. Let's go ahead and slip into chapter 24. Now after 5 days, Ananias the high priest came down with the elders and a certain orator named Tertullus. These gave evidence to the governor against Paul. And when he was called upon, Tertullus began his accusation, saying, Seeing that through you we enjoy great peace and prosperity as being brought to this nation by your foresight, we accept it always and in all places, most noble Felix, with all thankfulness. Nevertheless, not to be tedious to you any further, I beg you to hear by your courtesy a few words from us. For we have found this man a plague, a creator of dissension among all the Jews throughout the world, and a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. He even tried to profane the temple, and we seized him, and wanted to judge him according to our law. But the commander Lysias came by, and with great violence took him out of our hands, commanding his accusers to come to you. By examining him yourself, you may ascertain all these things of which we accuse him. And the Jews also assented, maintaining that these things were so. All right, we'll pause there. So, they've waited 5 days. You would have thought that there would have been a little bit more urgency about this, that they would have hurried up and gotten down there as quick as they could. But they've waited for 5 days, and they get this guy who is an orator named Tertullus. Why would you get an orator? Why wouldn't you just go in and present your case? Well, one of the reasons you want an orator is kind of there briefly when he begins to speak. Orators are very good at something that was very prominent at that point in time, and that is gaining, how shall I put it, gaining favor through flattery. In other words, you will find many times in the Scriptures that someone tries to gain favor with whoever the governing body is by flattering them first. Even when you get into even to the Gospels, go back and remember, what did Nicodemus do when he came to Jesus? He started off by flattering him, because that was the custom. That's how you sought favor, is you would flatter the individual or the counselor, whoever you were speaking to, in order to get them to listen more favorably to what you were about to say. And if you want a Roman governor to listen to you Jews, what do? Not only do you want to flatter him, you want to get someone who specializes in flattery. And it was very articulate. And so they get an orator named Tertullus. One of the interesting things is the name Tertullus is not a Hebrew name. Did you notice that? But he includes himself when he says, "We found this man." So apparently Tertullus is a Jewish proselyte who is speaking on behalf of the Jews. He's not actually Jewish by bloodline, but Jewish because he has converted to Judaism. Okay? And so he starts off by flattering Felix, and then he also tries to make note that he's giving them a courtesy, even listening to them, even though the law says he's got to, because he's the governor, and Paul is from Cilicia, which falls under his domain of rule, and therefore he is required to sit in judgment. And then he goes on. Then he gets into his accusations. "We have found this man a plague, a creator of dissension among all the Jews throughout the world, and a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes." All right. Causing dissension. He's a plague. And when you are making these accusations, you need to be careful, because one of the things that is very important, if he's really this big of a problem, Felix probably should have already heard about him. I mean, he's causing dissension all over the world among the Jews, which means he's causing unrest, and he's a plague. And yet, you're going to see as we go through here that word hasn't gotten to Felix about this guy as being such a person. Okay? But then one of the other things that we see here is at this point in time, Christianity is still considered to be a sect of Judaism. Because as Tertullus says, he's a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. And so, it's not until later that Christianity is no longer considered to be a sect of Judaism, but a complete entity of its own, so to speak. But then, as we go down through here, it says, he even tried to profane the temple, and we seized him. And here's the interesting thing. Even when they were back in Jerusalem, they could not prove that. The evidence is not there. And as you look down through here, you notice that there is no real evidence ever presented. It's all basically done as hearsay. You know, he even tried to profane the temple, and we seized him and wanted to judge him according to our law. But no evidence that that's actually what was taking place. As a matter of fact, the real evidence from anyone who was actually in the temple when they came in to seize him would have said, no, he wasn't doing any of this stuff. He was there fulfilling a vow. He was there going through the process of cleansing, of purification. He was doing everything according to the law of Moses, which is just the opposite of what they're saying. And so as they're going through this, they're not presenting any real evidence. They're just making claims. But then look, the commander Lysias came by. Well, he just happened to stroll by. And took him out of our hands with great violence. If Felix is any kind of governor at all, he knows that Roman soldiers do not take that kind of action without legitimate reason. Roman soldiers were very well trained and held to very high standards. Yes, you wanted them to be able to put down riots and rebellions, but you did not want them taking action that would cause riots and rebellions. And so they were very, very thoroughly trained in restraint. They had very high standards. That is one of the things that set the Roman army apart from the armies of preceding nations, is the high standards they were held to. That gave the Romans the ability to be able to rule with an iron fist the way they did. And so you can kind of imagine Felix listening to this, and what's running through his mind is, if Lysias had to remove him violently, what was really going on? And then he's also thinking about Lysias saying, I had to rescue him. And as things pan out, you kind of get the idea. Felix is starting to kind of connect the dots. He's not really getting anything from the Jews that's clear and cut and dry. He didn't really get anything super specific from Lysias. But when you start to compare the two narratives, you begin to realize things are not exactly as they're being presented. And then they tell Felix, by examining him yourself, you may ascertain all these things of which we accuse him. Okay. Without any evidence, how's he supposed to ascertain anything? Where's the evidence? Where are the witnesses? Where's the proof that what you are saying is true? But it's not there. Oh, but you can ascertain it. In other words, they're wanting the Romans to do something to try and find evidence, because they've got nothing to offer. Any thoughts, comments before we pick up? And we pick up at verse 10. Then Paul, after the governor had nodded to him to speak, answered, Inasmuch as I know that you have been for many years a judge of this nation, I do more cheerfully answer for myself, because you may ascertain that it is no more than 12 days since I went up to Jerusalem to worship. And they neither found me in the temple disputing with anyone or inciting the crowd, either in the synagogues or in the city. Nor can they prove the things of which they now accuse me. But this I confess to you, that according to the way which they call a sect, so I worship the God of my fathers, believing all things which are written in the law and the prophets. I have hope in God, which they themselves also accept, that there will be a resurrection of the dead, both of the just and the unjust. This being so, I myself always strive to have a conscience without offense toward God and men. Now, after many years, I came to bring alms and offerings to my nation, in the midst of which some Jews from Asia found me purified in the temple, neither with a mob nor with tumult. They ought to have been here before you to object if they had anything against me. Or else let those who are here themselves say if they found any wrongdoing in me while I stood before the council. Unless it is for this one statement which I cried out, standing among them, concerning the resurrection of the dead. I am being judged by you this day. All right. So, Paul once again makes his defense. And he makes it very plain that nothing has been presented to prove the accusations against him. As a matter of fact, he even goes on to say that if you do actually decide to look into this, if you do strive to ascertain what really went on, this is what you're going to find out. That just the opposite of what they are claiming was taking place. Yes, I was in the temple, but I wasn't arguing with anyone. I wasn't causing any dissension. I wasn't creating a mess or anything like that. Not even in the synagogues throughout the city. Instead, they found me purified according to the law. There peacefully. And the ones who did come in and seize me, why aren't they here? They should be here. The ones that started all this are the ones that should be here. What happened? What would even happen in the courts today if the ones who had initially started everything didn't show up? Be thrown out. Because the obvious is, if what they are saying is true, they would be there. And the lack of their presence is the same thing as saying, we just stirred up trouble, it didn't really happen. We were just trying to get people upset with him. And none of the things we said were actually going on. We just said that to get the crowd stirred up. And so the lack of their presence, and the Apostle Paul is making note of that because of that reason. They should be here. If these accusations were true, they're the ones that should be here because they're the ones that went into the temple and drugged me out. Not these people that are here. In other words, everything that you are hearing now is just hearsay. And he explains the fact that, yes, he's a follower of the way. And then he's pointing out that he doesn't consider it to be a sect of Judaism. Because notice how he makes that distinction in there. It says, but I confess to you that according to the way which they call a sect. He says, not that I call a sect, that they call a sect. So I worship the God of my fathers, believing all things which are written in the law and the prophets. In other words, what he's saying is, I believe everything they believe. I believe the law and the prophets that they believe. The reason I am here is because I am on trial for believing in the resurrection of the dead. And that puts those who are there in a sticky situation. Because if you read through the narrative there, you understand that the Sadducees didn't show up either. And if Felix begins to question them on the resurrection of the dead, guess what's going to happen? They're going to start agreeing with Paul. Yeah, we believe in the resurrection of the dead. Yeah, we believe in spirits. And then why is he here? And you can kind of begin to sense those who came from Jerusalem to accuse him beginning to squirm a little bit because they realize they are being backed into a corner. Because if Felix actually does start asking the tough questions, they're going to be put in a position of the only way you can get anything against Paul is if you deny what you believe. And that's something that would not sit well with a Jew. You do not deny who you are, and you do not deny what you believe. And the Apostle Paul has said, I believe the same thing they believe. But I'm on trial here because I cried out, because of the resurrection of the dead, I'm being judged. And that caused an upheaval because when he cried it out, The Sadducees were there, and they started arguing with each other. And so the Apostle Paul is giving Felix everything he needs to ask the right questions. And you can sense the atmosphere changing as you read through the narrative. Comes in with the accusations and the flattery and they're coming in. You can almost sense them coming in with this orator, and they've got this great confidence. Well, we're going to accomplish something here. We've got the orator. We're going to accomplish something. And then the Apostle Paul speaks, and you find yourself in a position that if this governor starts asking me questions, there's going to be a problem. Because remember, Lysias wrote that it was concerning issues of their law. The Apostle Paul has just said, I agree with the law. And if you begin to ascertain what's going on, if you begin to ask the questions, you'll begin to find out that between me and the ones who are here, there's no disagreement. But remember what we've talked about time and time again, and we have seen it blatantly spelled out in the book of Acts. Why do the Pharisees want to get rid of him when they agree with everything? Remember, time and time again, Scripture's told us, because they were jealous. Not because they disagreed with everything he was teaching, but because they were jealous of the fact that he was drawing followers away from them. They wanted their prestige. They wanted their followers. They didn't want someone coming in and drawing them away. And we saw that spelled out over and over again, that the Jews became jealous. The Jews became jealous, and they stirred everything up. And so the only reason that the Pharisees would actually have had for coming to Jerusalem and not necessarily seeing that the Sadducees came with them is because of jealousy. They just want to get rid of him because they're jealous. And so they're hoping that they can just come in and say, we found him to be causing all kinds of problems and so on. And Felix will say, okay, that's fine. We'll deal with it. But then the Apostle Paul speaks and everything begins to change. And we'll pick up at verse 22 very quickly for just a couple of verses here. But when Felix heard these things, having more accurate knowledge of the way, he adjourned the proceedings and said, when Lysias the commander comes down, I will make a decision on your case. So he commanded the centurion to keep Paul and to let him have liberty, and told him not to forbid any of his friends to provide for or visit him. And we're going to stop there. And so we see how it's changed. Major change. Because one of the interesting things is that Felix heard these things, having more accurate knowledge of the way. In other words, apparently what the Jews didn't realize is Felix is familiar with the way. He's familiar with Christians. He's familiar with what they teach. He's familiar with what they do. And he knows from his knowledge of Christianity that the accusations are false. And he's going to wait for Lysias to come down so he can just confirm exactly what he's already ascertained without asking questions. Because like I said, as you read through the narrative, you can begin to picture Felix connecting the dots as to what's really going on. And so the only thing he wants is for Lysias to come down so that he can confirm what he's already figured out from what's been said. And the fact that he gives Paul liberty and that he's allowed to have visitors anytime he wants tells you that he already knows Paul's innocent. But he needs the commander to come down who arrested him to confirm exactly what he has ascertained. And then he will be prepared to make a decision. Any thoughts, comments before we end? You know, one of the interesting things that I find throughout all of this is when you really look at what's happening, you see the hand of God working to get Paul where he wants him. Because remember, God's already told Paul through the Holy Spirit, you're going to Rome. And so everything we see taking place is God putting everything in place to get him there on Rome's dime. And we'll end there and pick up at verse 24 next week.